The words were spoken calmly, almost politely, but they landed like a political earthquake, accusing a global superpower of violating international law while placing South Africa at the moral center of world affairs. And in that moment, many people listening felt something was deeply off, not just about what was said, but about why it was said, and who it was really meant to convince. The claim was simple on the surface, that international law had been violated, that the United Nations Charter had been breached, and that the Security Council must intervene because the world was now facing a dangerous precedent where any country could invade another without consequence. But beneath that language of diplomacy and legal principle sat a far more complicated political reality, one that raises uncomfortable questions about power, consistency, and credibility. When South Africa's governing party speaks about international law, it invokes a painful history of injustice, colonialism, and global indifference, and that history gives its voice weight. But it also places a heavy responsibility on those who speak in its name. Are these principles being applied consistently or selectively? That is the question many South Africans quietly ask, and it is one worth sitting with. The reference to the United Nations Security Council sounds reassuring, almost noble, as if global wisdom will somehow prevail if the right meeting is called. Yet viewers might wonder, how often has the Security Council actually delivered justice rather than stalemate? How many conflicts has it failed to resolve because of veto power and political alliances? Criticism quickly followed from opposition parties, especially the Democratic Alliance, accusing the ANC of hypocrisy, pointing to Venezuela on one hand and Russia and Ukraine on the other. This accusation struck a nerve because it tapped into a growing public frustration, the sense that foreign policy is driven less by principle and more by political friendships forged decades ago. The ANC's response was firm and confident. South Africa, they said, had spoken to both sides in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. South Africa had access where others did not. South Africa could call Moscow and Kiev and be heard. That sounds impressive, but it also invites a deeper question. Access is not the same as influence, and dialogue is not the same as results. What tangible peace has emerged from this unique position? Supporters of the government argue that neutrality and engagement are strengths, that South Africa's role as a bridge builder reflects maturity and responsibility. Critics argue the opposite, that neutrality in the face of aggression is not neutrality at all, but quiet endorsement. Which interpretation feels closer to the truth to you? The mention of prisoner exchanges and the return of children from Ukraine is emotionally powerful, and rightly so. Those are human victories. But can humanitarian gestures alone justify a broader political stance that seems unwilling to clearly name aggressors when it matters most? Then comes Venezuela, a country thousands of kilometers away, but deeply symbolic in global ideological battles. The statement condemns alleged actions by the United States and declares solidarity with the Venezuelan people, even demanding the release of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife. This is where many listeners pause, rewind, and listen again. Release from what exactly? And under whose authority? This is where credibility begins to fray. International audiences, and even many South Africans, know that Maduro's legitimacy is widely contested, his government accused of repression, electoral manipulation, and economic collapse. So when the ANC positions itself as defender of Venezuelan sovereignty without acknowledging these realities, it appears less like principled internationalism and more like ideological loyalty. Why does this matter domestically? Because foreign policy is never just foreign. It reflects values, priorities, and the way power is understood at home. A government that struggles to deliver basic services, reduce unemployment, or combat corruption is asking citizens to trust its judgment on global justice. That disconnect is impossible to ignore. The speech then shifts tone, invoking Joe Slovo, the Constitution, the Freedom Charter, and the long struggle against apartheid. These references are powerful, emotional, and deeply rooted in South Africa's identity. They remind people of sacrifice, vision, and moral clarity. But they also raise an uncomfortable contrast between the ideals of the past and the realities of the present. Joe Slovo stood for accountability, debate, and intellectual honesty. He believed in transformation that improved the material lives of ordinary people. Would he be satisfied with a political culture where criticism is brushed aside as selective memory and hard questions are deflected rather than confronted? The ANC speaks of national renewal and social equity, yet South Africa remains one of the most unequal societies in the world. Youth unemployment is devastating. Infrastructure is crumbling. Public trust is eroding. Against this backdrop, grand statements on international law can feel detached, even performative. Some viewers might ask, is this foreign policy about justice, or about maintaining old alliances from a Cold War world that no longer exists? Is it about standing with oppressed people, or standing with governments that share a similar political history? The governing party insists it is not hypocritical, that it is practical and honest. But honesty requires acknowledging contradictions. It requires admitting when principles collide with political convenience. Without that, words lose their power. There is also the issue of accountability. Who decides these positions? Who debates them internally? Are ordinary South Africans, struggling with load shedding and rising costs, represented in these global stances, or are they spectators to decisions made far above their heads? The invocation of the UN Charter is especially striking given how often international law has failed weaker nations, including African ones. Selective enforcement has long been a grievance of the global South. Yet selective outrage risks reproducing the very injustice it seeks to condemn. As the speech honors revolutionary history, it blends past and present into a single narrative of righteousness. But history does not automatically validate current choices. Every generation must earn its moral authority anew. The danger here is not that South Africa speaks on global issues. It should. The danger is that it does so without the self-reflection needed to maintain trust at home and credibility abroad. What happens when citizens begin to see foreign policy statements as ideological theater rather than genuine advocacy? What happens when the language of liberation is used to defend power rather than challenge it? This moment reveals more than a position on Venezuela or Ukraine. It reveals a governing party deeply invested in its identity as a moral actor, even as its performance in governance is increasingly questioned. International solidarity, when grounded in principle, can be powerful. When grounded in selective memory, it becomes fragile. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this. If international law is invoked loudly abroad while trust erodes at home, what happens when citizens start applying the same standards of accountability to their own leaders and discover that the answers are far less clear than the speeches suggest?